At my daughter's wedding, her husband called me a worthless immigrant loser. I'm James Anderson, and I'd stayed quiet for 2 years. What Brandon Miller didn't know was that his fancy investment banking firm paid me $2.3 million in rent every year. He didn't know I owned 38 downtown office buildings, including the one where he worked. Tonight, his arrogance would cost him everything he'd built. Because when you humiliate a billionaire who's been hiding in plain sight, the consequences come with compound interest. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single document. My hands didn't shake. My voice stayed level. But the paper I held would end his career in 72 hours. If you're watching this, please subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Have you ever been underestimated because of how you look or sound? Here's how a quiet immigrant taught an entitled banker that respect isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn and lose. 2 years ago, when Sarah brought Brandon home for the first time, I knew we had a problem. He walked into our modest 3-bedroom house in Cedar Park, Texas, and I watched his eyes do a quick scan. The worn leather couch I'd had for 15 years, the small TV mounted on the wall, the family photos showing me in work clothes, concrete dust still on my boots. "So, Mr. Anderson," he said, settling into our recliner like he was interviewing me, "Sarah tells me you're retired from construction work." The way he said construction work made it sound like a disease. "Built houses for 35 years, I replied. "Good, honest work." Brandon nodded with that smile people use when they're trying to be polite about something they find disappointing. That's admirable. Manual labor is so important for society. Sarah shot me a look. She knew that tone. Over the next 2 years, the comments got more frequent, more pointed. At family dinners, Brandon would steer conversations away from my stories about job sites and building projects. When I mentioned fixing something around the house, he'd joke about blue-collar solutions. When Sarah's friends visited, he'd introduce me as Sarah's dad, who worked construction. Never Jim, never by name. Just Sarah's dad, who worked construction. The worst part? Sarah started doing it too. "Dad, Brandon's colleagues are coming to dinner," she'd say. "Maybe wear the blue shirt instead of the flannel." "Don't mention the duplex rentals," she'd add quietly. "They might not understand." What she didn't know was that those duplex rentals had grown into something much bigger. At their engagement party last spring, Brandon gave a speech to his Morgan Stanley colleagues about marrying into a humble working-class family. He talked about how it would ground him and help him remember his values. 200 people applauded while I stood there, holding my beer, feeling like a museum exhibit. "My father-in-law taught me that honest work comes in many forms," Brandon said, raising his glass toward me, "even if it's not in a boardroom." The laughter was polite but pointed. I could have spoken up then, could have shown him the business cards in my wallet, the property deeds in my home office, the Forbes article from 2018 that called me one of Texas's quiet titans. But I didn't. Why? Because Sarah loved him. Because she was happy. Because I remembered what it felt like to be 28 and trying to build a life. When I came to America from Ireland in 1983, I had $340 in my pocket and a thick accent that made people assume I was uneducated. I'd learned to stay quiet, work hard, and let my results speak for themselves. For 40 years, that strategy had served me well. But tonight, at the Fairmont Austin Hotel, surrounded by 180 wedding guests, Brandon Miller was about to learn the difference between staying quiet by choice and staying quiet because you're weak. The reception was in full swing. Sarah looked beautiful in her grandmother's pearls and the $3,200 dress we'd bought at Nordstrom. The string quartet played soft jazz while guests mingled around tables decorated with white roses and gold accents. I'd paid for the wedding, all $85,000 of it. Brandon's parents had contributed exactly nothing, citing cash flow issues from his father's recent retirement. But as I watched Brandon work the room, introducing Sarah to his colleagues and superiors, I heard the same pattern over and over. This is my wife, Sarah. She comes from a modest background, but she's incredibly driven. Sarah's father is a simple man, salt-of-the-earth type. We're so different, but opposites attract, right? Each introduction made my chest tighter, because what Brandon Miller didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the quiet man in the corner, nursing his whiskey and watching their expensive suits, owned the building where half of them worked. As I stood at the bar watching Brandon introduce Sarah to his managing director, Patricia Wells, I faced a choice that would define the rest of my relationship with my daughter. Stay quiet, and Brandon would continue to diminish me for years to come. Our family dinners would remain exercises in subtle humiliation. My grandchildren would grow up thinking their grandfather was just the construction guy who couldn't understand their world, but speak up, and I'd risk destroying Sarah's marriage on her wedding night. The stakes were crystal clear. Sarah had worked at Dell Technologies for 3 years, building a solid reputation in their corporate development division. She was smart, capable, and ambitious, but she was also married to a man who introduced her as coming from modest circumstances, like she was a charity case he'd rescued. If I stayed silent tonight, that narrative would become permanent. Brandon would spend the next decade explaining Sarah's humble background to justify why she deserved opportunities. He'd position himself as her generous savior, the successful banker who looked past her simple family to see her potential. And Sarah gradually would start believing it. I'd already seen it happening, the way she'd apologize for my presence at their engagement party, the way she'd change the subject when I mentioned business, the way she'd started saying we're different kinds of people when talking about her childhood. My daughter was disappearing into Brandon's version of her story. On the other hand, revealing the truth tonight would shatter everything Brandon had built his identity around. His colleagues would discover that the humble immigrant he'd been condescending to for 2 years was actually their landlord. His managing director would realize he'd been disrespecting a major client, but it would also humiliate him publicly on his wedding night in front of 180 people. And Sarah might never forgive me. I thought about my wife, Margaret, who'd passed 5 years ago. She'd built our family's financial foundation alongside me, managing the books while I managed the properties. She'd been the one who insisted we keep our wealth quiet. Let Sarah have a normal childhood, Margaret had said. Let her earn her own respect. We'd driven 10-year-old Toyotas while owning $200 million in real estate. We'd shopped at Target while tenants paid us 7-figure rents. We'd lived modestly while building an empire. Margaret's strategy had worked. Sarah had earned her college degree without financial pressure. She'd landed her job on merit. She'd developed confidence and independence. But Margaret had also said something else near the end. If anyone ever treats our family with genuine disrespect, you show them exactly who they're dealing with. Tonight, Brandon Miller had crossed that line. As I watched him laugh with his colleagues about marrying down, I realized that staying quiet wasn't protecting Sarah anymore. It was enabling her husband's arrogance. My silence had become permission, and Brandon Miller was about to learn that my generosity had limits. I finished my whiskey, set the glass on the bar, and walked toward my briefcase. Inside were documents that would change everything: property deeds, lease agreements, and financial statements that told the real story of who James Anderson actually was. The question wasn't whether I should use them. The question was whether I'd let my daughter spend her marriage apologizing for where she came from. The moment came during the cocktail hour, when Brandon was holding court with 5 of his Morgan Stanley colleagues near the champagne fountain. I approached their circle carrying my briefcase. Brandon saw me coming and his expression shifted. That look people get when an unwanted relative approaches during an important business conversation. "Dad," Sarah said, appearing at my elbow. Brandon's just talking shop with his team. That's fine, I said quietly. I'd like to introduce myself properly. Brandon's laugh was nervous. Actually, Jim, we're discussing some pretty complex financial instruments. Might be a bit over your head. His colleagues smiled politely. Patricia Wells, the managing director, glanced at her watch. Try me, I said. Dad, please, Sarah whispered. Brandon's smile widened. He was enjoying this. Okay, we're structuring a $400 million commercial real estate acquisition. Multi-property portfolio, very technical stuff. Interesting, I said. What's the cap rate? The smile faltered slightly. Excuse me. Capitalization rate. Net operating income divided by property value. Basic real estate metric. One of his colleagues, a younger analyst, looked impressed. 6.2%. That's decent for Austin, I said. What class properties? A, B, or C? Brandon's jaw tightened. Mixed portfolio. Mostly Class A office buildings. Downtown core or suburban? Mix of both. I nodded thoughtfully. I know that market pretty well. Really? Brandon's voice carried an edge now. And how exactly would a construction worker know commercial real estate metrics? The circle went quiet. Sarah's hand touched my arm. You'd be surprised what you pick up, I said. Brandon turned to his colleagues with exaggerated amazement. Isn't this fascinating? Jim here thinks he understands our business better than we do. Patricia Wells looked uncomfortable. Brandon, maybe we should... No, this is great, Brandon continued. Jim, since you're such an expert, maybe you should give us investment advice. Tell us which buildings we should buy. His colleagues shifted nervously. This was getting awkward. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a simple white business card. You might want to look at the Anderson Properties portfolio. Brandon took the card without looking at it. Anderson Properties? Never heard of them. They own some interesting assets downtown. Like what? I met his eyes directly. Office buildings. 38 of them, actually. Brandon glanced down at the card for the first time. His expression changed as he read it. James Anderson, CEO, Anderson Properties, LLC. The color drained from his face. Wait, he said slowly. This is your company. That's right. But you're... He looked around at his colleagues, who were now staring at the business card. You're a construction worker. I was. For 15 years. Then I bought my first duplex in 1987. Patricia Wells stepped forward, her expression shifting. Mr. Anderson, did you say Anderson Properties? Yes, ma'am. She looked at Brandon, then back at me. We've been trying to get a meeting with Anderson Properties for 6 months. They own half the buildings we lease space in. Brandon's hand was trembling slightly as he held the business card. This is impossible. What's impossible? I asked. You can't own Anderson Properties. They're worth about $1.4 billion, last appraisal. The silence stretched for 10 seconds. Wedding guests continued chatting around us, unaware that Brandon Miller's world was collapsing in real time. Dad? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. I turned to her with the same calm expression I'd worn all evening. Yes, sweetheart. Is this real? Very real. Brandon was staring at the business card like it might catch fire. But why didn't you ever... Never came up. Never came up? His voice cracked. You let me think you were just a... Just a what, Brandon? He looked around at his colleagues, who were now studying him with professional curiosity. Patricia Wells was clearly recalculating everything she thought she knew about this conversation. I don't understand, Brandon said weakly. It's simple, I replied. You assumed. I didn't correct you. But the house? The clothes? The truck? I like my house. My clothes are comfortable. The truck runs fine. Sarah was staring at me like she'd never seen me before. Dad, why didn't you tell me? Your mother and I wanted you to build your own life, make your own way. Brandon's colleague, the young analyst, cleared his throat. Mr. Anderson, we've been trying to contact your company about leasing opportunities. Do you handle tenant relations personally? I smiled. Depends on the tenant. Brandon made a choking sound. Patricia Wells extended her hand. Mr. Anderson, I'm Patricia Wells, Managing Director at Morgan Stanley, Private Wealth. I believe we manage some investment accounts for Anderson Properties. That's right. Since 2019? Brandon looked like he might faint. The first round was over. 20 minutes later, Brandon pulled me aside near the hotel's marble staircase, away from the reception noise. His confidence was returning, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. He'd had time to think, and thinking was dangerous for a man like Brandon Miller. Jim, I need to understand what's happening here. What's to understand? This business card. This company. He held up the card like evidence. I've never seen you in any real estate circles. Never seen your name in the Austin Business Journal. I keep a low profile. Nobody keeps this low a profile. His voice was gaining strength. A $1.4 billion company doesn't just hide. I could see him building a case in his mind, looking for the flaw, the explanation that would put me back in the box where I belonged. Maybe you're partners with Anderson Properties. Maybe you do maintenance work for them. Maybe you should do your research before you decide what's possible. But Brandon was already pulling out his phone. Let me just verify a few things. He walked to the corner, his fingers flying across his screen. I watched him search, scroll, frown, search again. After 5 minutes, he returned with a puzzled expression. I can't find much about Anderson Properties online. Just basic corporate filings. No executive profiles. No media coverage. I told you, I keep a low profile. But there's one thing. His eyes lit up with what he thought was victory. Forbes mentioned an Anderson Properties in 2018. Some article about quiet titans. But they didn't use any photos. Just called the owner a reclusive real estate investor. So here's what I think happened. Brandon's confidence was fully restored now. You saw that article? You had this business card made. You're playing some kind of elaborate joke. I looked at him steadily. Why would I do that? Because you're embarrassed. Because you want to impress my colleagues. Because you can't stand that I'm successful and you're not. The accusation hung in the air between us. Brandon! My voice stayed level. What's the address of your office? What? Your office at Morgan Stanley. What's the address? 221 West 6th Street. Why? Nice building. Granite lobby, 32 floors. Yeah, so you pay about $87 per square foot for that space. Prime downtown location. Brandon frowned. How could you possibly know our rent per square foot? Lucky guess. But I could see the doubt creeping back into his expression. Because that number was exactly right, and there was no way a construction worker should know it. The lease runs through December 2026, I continued, renewable for 2 5-year terms. Your firm occupies floors 18 through 22. Brandon's face went pale again. How do you? Property management is detail work, but you'd have to be. What? He couldn't finish the sentence, because to know those details, I'd have to be exactly who I claimed to be. Meanwhile, Sarah had been watching this conversation from across the room. She approached us with Patricia Wells, who looked like she had something important to say. Dad, Patricia was telling me about Anderson Properties. Patricia Wells smiled professionally. Mr. Anderson, I hope you don't mind, but I called our office to pull your account information. Brandon straightened. Here it was, the proof that would expose my lie. Our wealth management division handles approximately $340 million in investment accounts for Anderson Properties, LLC, Patricia continued. The account was opened in September 2019. Brandon's mouth fell open. We've been hoping to expand that relationship, Patricia said. Anderson Properties has been one of our most sophisticated clients. Very conservative investment strategy. excellent returns." "You're serious," Brandon whispered. "Completely serious." Patricia looked confused. "Brandon, you told me Sarah's family was from a modest background." Brandon's eyes darted between Patricia, Sarah, and me. The pieces were clicking into place, and the picture wasn't one he liked. "I need some air," he said suddenly. But as he started to walk away, Patricia called after him. "Brandon, wait!" "There's something else you should know." He stopped. "Your office building, 221 West 6th Street. We've been negotiating a lease renewal on behalf of one of our real estate clients." Brandon turned slowly. "What client?" Patricia looked at me, then back at Brandon. "Anderson Properties owns your building, Brandon. They've been your landlord for 2 years. The blood drained completely from Brandon's face. "That's impossible." "I have the documents in my car if you'd like to see them." Sarah was staring at me with a mixture of shock and something else I couldn't quite read. Pride, confusion, fear. "Dad," she said quietly, "is she telling the truth?" "She is." "So every month when Brandon goes to work?" "He goes to work in my building." Brandon sat down heavily in a nearby chair. "This isn't happening." But it was happening, and it was about to get much worse, because Brandon Miller had spent 2 years disrespecting the man who owned the ground beneath his feet. And now, in front of his managing director and his new wife, he was learning that respect isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn, and something you can lose very, very quickly. The question was whether Brandon was smart enough to recognize his situation and apologize, or arrogant enough to keep digging his hole deeper. Based on everything I'd seen over the past 2 years, I suspected I knew which path he'd choose. The moment I knew there was no going back came during the toasts. Brandon had retreated to the bar after learning about the building ownership, but instead of processing the information and adjusting his behavior, he'd started drinking, heavily. By the time dinner was served, he'd consumed at least 4 whiskeys. His cheeks were flushed, his eyes were bright, and his judgment was completely gone. That's when he decided to give an impromptu speech. The string quartet had just finished playing, and the natural lull gave Brandon his opening. He stood up at the head table, tapped his knife against his champagne flute, and waited for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying across the ballroom, "if I could have your attention for just a moment." The 180 guests turned toward him expectantly. Sarah looked nervous. "I want to talk about family tonight," Brandon began, his words slightly slurred, but still clear enough for everyone to hear. "About where we come from and where we're going." I felt a knot forming in my stomach. When I met Sarah 2 years ago, I was struck by her strength, her determination to rise above her circumstances. He gestured toward our table. "She comes from humble beginnings, working-class family, blue-collar background." A few guests nodded approvingly. This seemed like it would be a sweet speech about overcoming differences. Brandon was just getting started. Her father, Jim Anderson, represents everything that's honest and simple about America. He worked with his hands for 35 years. Construction, manual labor. Brandon's smile was condescending, even as he pretended to praise me. "Now, Jim has some interesting stories about business and real estate, don't you, Jim?" All eyes turned to me. I said nothing. "In fact," Brandon continued, his voice getting louder, "Jim here was just telling my colleagues about some property company he supposedly owns. Anderson Properties, I think it was." A murmur went through the crowd. Patricia Wells looked uncomfortable. "Now I want to be clear. There's nothing wrong with having big dreams. There's nothing wrong with wanting to impress people." Brandon's tone was becoming openly mocking now. But sometimes, when people feel insecure about their place in the world, they tell stories. They create fantasies about secret wealth and hidden success. Sarah stood up. "Brandon, stop!" "No, honey, this is important." Brandon waved her off, because what I learned tonight is that respect has to be earned, and you don't earn respect by pretending to be something you're not. The ballroom was dead silent now. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving. Jim Anderson is a good man, a simple man. He built houses and raised a wonderful daughter. Brandon raised his glass toward me. But he's not a real estate mogul. He's not a secret billionaire. He's just a retired construction worker who wants to feel important at his daughter's wedding. The cruel laughter that followed was scattered but audible. And that's okay, Brandon continued. We can't all be successful in business. We can't all understand the complex financial instruments. Some of us are meant to work with our hands, and some of us are meant to work with our minds. I watched my daughter's face crumble as her husband publicly humiliated her family. So let's toast to honesty, Brandon said, raising his glass higher, to knowing our place in the world, to simple people living simple lives, and successful people building something greater. The applause was confused and reluctant. Most guests could sense that something had gone wrong, but they weren't sure what. But Brandon wasn't finished. Jim, why don't you stand up? Let everyone see the real patriarch of the Anderson family, the man who builds other people's dreams instead of his own. The mockery in his voice was unmistakable now. That's when I stood. The ballroom fell completely silent as I rose from my chair. All 180 guests were staring at me, waiting to see how the simple construction worker would respond to being publicly demolished by his son-in-law. I walked slowly to the microphone, my briefcase in hand. Brandon stepped aside with a smug smile, clearly believing he'd won some kind of victory. I adjusted the microphone and looked out at the crowd. Patricia Wells was watching intently. Sarah was fighting back tears. The other guests were leaning forward, sensing drama. Brandon makes some interesting points, I said quietly, about honesty, about knowing your place in the world. Brandon nodded approvingly. He's right that respect has to be earned, I continued, and he's right that some people work with their hands while others work with their minds. I could see Brandon relaxing, thinking I was going to meekly agree with his assessment. What Brandon doesn't know, I said, opening my briefcase, is that the best business people do both. I pulled out a manila folder and set it on the podium. These are property deeds, I announced, 38 of them, downtown Austin office buildings, purchased between 1987 and 2023. The silence was complete now. Total portfolio value, according to the most recent appraisal, $1.4 billion. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Brandon is correct about one thing. I did work construction for 35 years. I built houses, office buildings, shopping centers. I learned every aspect of real estate development from the ground up. I could see Brandon's face losing color. And then I started buying the buildings I helped construct. I pulled out another document. This is the lease agreement for 221 West 6th Street, the building where Morgan Stanley Private Wealth has their Austin offices. Patricia Wells nodded slowly. Rent, $2.3 million annually, paid by Morgan Stanley to Anderson Properties, LLC. Tenant manager, Brandon Miller. The crowd was completely still, so Brandon is absolutely right. We should know our place in the world. I looked directly at him. Your place is in my building, paying me rent, every month, for the past 2 years. Brandon's champagne glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. The sound echoed through the silent ballroom like a gunshot. The silence after the champagne glass shattered lasted exactly 7 seconds. Then Patricia Wells started laughing. Not cruel laughter, not mocking laughter. The laughter of someone who suddenly understood a joke that had been building for 2 years. "Oh my God," she said, loud enough for half the ballroom to hear. "Brandon, you've been condescending to our biggest client." Brandon looked like he'd been struck by lightning. "What?" Patricia stood up, walked to the head table, and extended her hand to me. "Mr. Anderson, I owe you an apology. If I'd known who you were tonight, this entire situation could have been avoided." "No apology necessary," I said, shaking her hand. "But there is." Patricia turned to address the crowd, speaking clearly into the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Patricia Wells, Managing Director at Morgan Stanley Private Wealth. I've had the privilege of managing Anderson Properties' investment portfolio for the past 4 years. She gestured toward me with obvious respect. Mr. James Anderson is one of Austin's most successful real estate developers. His company owns more than half the downtown office space that houses Austin's major financial firms. The crowd was hanging on every word. Anderson Properties has generated over $190 million in annual rental income for the past 3 years. Mr. Anderson is, by any measure, one of Texas's most successful businessmen. Brandon was gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping him upright. He's also, Patricia continued with a slight smile, Brandon's landlord. That's when the murmurs started, wedding guests turning to each other, processing what they'd just learned. The quiet man in the corner wasn't a simple construction worker. He was the person who owned the buildings where many of them worked. But I wasn't finished. I pulled out another document from my briefcase. This is a Forbes article from September 2018. Quiet Titans. The billionaires you've never heard of. I held up the magazine page, showing the headline and my photo, the first public picture I'd ever allowed. Anderson Properties was featured as one of America's most successful private real estate companies, built without investors, without debt, without publicity. Sarah was staring at the magazine page like she was seeing a ghost. The article estimated our net worth at $1.2 billion. The actual number is now $1.4 billion. Brandon made a sound somewhere between a groan and a whimper. Now, I said, looking out at the crowd. Brandon was absolutely right about something. Respect does have to be earned. I turned to face him directly. The question is, what happens when someone shows profound disrespect to the person who's been quietly earning their respect for 40 years? Brandon tried to speak, but no words came out. Patricia Wells was watching this unfold with the fascination of someone seeing a masterclass in quiet power. For 2 years, I continued, I've listened to Brandon explain to people that Sarah comes from a modest background. I've watched him apologize for my presence at family gatherings. I've heard him tell colleagues that marrying Sarah was an act of charity. The crowd was completely captivated now. I stayed quiet because I wanted Sarah to build her own life. Because I believed in letting people show their true character. Because I thought respect would come naturally once Brandon got to know our family. Sarah was crying now, but I couldn't tell if they were tears of shame, pride, or relief. Instead, Brandon used my silence as permission to diminish everything I'd built, everything our family represents. I pulled out one final document. This is the rental agreement for the Fairmont Austin Hotel, the building where we're celebrating tonight. I held it up for everyone to see. Owned by Anderson Properties since 2021. Several guests gasped audibly. So Brandon gave his speech about knowing our place in my hotel after spending 2 years working in my office building while married to my daughter. Brandon finally found his voice. Jim, I didn't know. You didn't know because you never asked. You assumed. The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning. You assumed that because I worked construction, I was uneducated. You assumed that because I drove an old truck, I was unsuccessful. You assumed that because I spoke with an accent, I was beneath you. Brandon's face was completely white now. But here's what you should have assumed, Brandon. If a man can raise a daughter like Sarah, if he can build a life that produces that kind of strength and intelligence and grace, then maybe, just maybe, there's more to that man than meets the eye. The crowd erupted in applause, but I held up my hand for silence. The tragedy here isn't that you underestimated me. The tragedy is that you've spent 2 years making my daughter apologize for where she comes from. I looked at Sarah, who was staring at me with a mixture of admiration and heartbreak. Sarah Anderson is the daughter of a billionaire real estate developer, She never needed you to lift her up. She never needed you to explain her worth to anyone. She was already valuable. The applause this time was thunderous, but as the crowd clapped, I watched Brandon's expression change from shock to humiliation to something darker. Rage. And I realized that a man who could spend 2 years systematically diminishing his wife's family wasn't going to simply accept this reversal with grace. He was going to fight back, which meant the real confrontation was just beginning. Brandon's rage erupted exactly 3 minutes after the applause died down. He grabbed the microphone from my hands with shaking fingers, his face twisted with humiliation and fury. "This is bullshit," he shouted onto the microphone, his voice echoing through the ballroom. "Complete bullshit." The crowd went silent again, but this time with shock at his outburst. "You want to know the truth?" Brandon's voice was slurring worse now. "This is all fake. Documents can be forged. Business cards can be printed. This is just a pathetic old man who can't stand that his daughter married someone successful." Patricia Wells stood up. "Brandon, you need to stop." "No," he pointed an accusing finger at me. "I've worked my ass off for 10 years. I've earned everything I have. I'm not going to be humiliated by some immigrant construction worker with a briefcase full of fake papers." Sarah stood up too. "Brandon, stop it. You're drunk." "I'm drunk?" Brandon laughed bitterly. "I'm the only sober person in this room. Everyone else is falling for this ridiculous con game." He turned back to the crowd, gripping the microphone stand for support. "You want proof he's lying? Call Anderson Properties tomorrow. Ask to speak to James Anderson. See what happens. Because I guarantee you this old man has never set foot in a boardroom in his life." That's when Patricia Wells walked to the head table, opened her purse, and pulled out her phone. "Actually, Brandon," she said clearly, "I can call right now." "What?" "Anderson Properties has a 24-hour property management line for emergencies." She held up her phone. "I have the number because we handle their investment accounts." Brandon's confidence faltered. That doesn't prove anything." Patricia dialed. The phone rang through the ballroom's sound system connected to the microphone. After 2 rings, a professional voice answered, "Anderson Properties emergency line." "This is Jennifer speaking." Patricia looked directly at Brandon. "Hi, Jennifer. This is Patricia Wells from Morgan Stanley. I'm here with Mr. Anderson at a family event. Could you confirm his identity for some guests?" "Of course, Ms. Wells. Is Mr. Anderson available?" Patricia handed me her phone. "Jennifer, this is Jim. Can you tell these folks what my position is with the company?" "Certainly, Mr. Anderson. You're the founder and CEO of Anderson Properties, LLC. Would you like me to read your bio from our corporate materials?" "That would be helpful." Jennifer's voice filled the ballroom. James Anderson founded Anderson Properties in 1987 with the purchase of a single duplex in East Austin. Over 36 years, he has built the company into one of Texas's largest private real estate portfolios, encompassing 38 downtown office buildings with a combined value exceeding $1.4 billion. Brandon was staring at the phone like it was a poisonous snake. The company generates approximately $190 million in annual rental income and maintains a 97% occupancy rate. Mr. Anderson is considered one of Austin's most successful private real estate developers. "Thank you, Jennifer," I said, ending the call. The ballroom was completely silent. Brandon's mouth was opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. That's when I opened my briefcase one final time and pulled out a manila envelope. "Brandon," I said quietly, "I tried to give you a chance to apologize, to show some humility, to demonstrate that you understood the situation." His eyes were fixed on the envelope. "Instead, you doubled down. You called me a liar. You accused me of fraud. You humiliated my daughter on her wedding night." I opened the envelope and pulled out a legal document. "This is a notice of lease termination for 221 West 6th Street. Anderson Properties' legal right to terminate any lease with 90 days' notice for breach of tenant conduct standards. Brandon's face went from white to green. Effective immediately, Morgan Stanley Private Wealth has 90 days to vacate the premises. Patricia Wells gasped, "Mr. Anderson, surely we can discuss this." "I'm not terminating Morgan Stanley's lease," I said clearly. "I'm terminating it because of Brandon Miller." I pulled out another document. This is a formal complaint to Morgan Stanley's Human Resources Department, documenting Brandon's public intoxication and unprofessional conduct toward a major client. Brandon tried to grab the documents, but I moved them out of reach. "And this," I said, producing a third paper, "is a letter to the Texas Department of Banking, questioning whether someone with Brandon's judgment and impulse control should maintain a financial services license." "You can't do this," Brandon whispered. "I can, and I am." Patricia Wells was looking at Brandon with undisguised disgust. "Brandon, you've just cost our firm a $2.3 million annual lease because you couldn't control your mouth." "But it's not fair," Brandon protested. "I didn't know." "That's the point," I said. "You didn't know because you didn't care enough to find out. You made assumptions based on prejudice, and you acted on those assumptions for 2 years. I handed the termination notice to Patricia Wells. "Ms. Wells, you have 90 days to find new office space. I'll provide positive references for Morgan Stanley as a company, but Mr. Miller's employment status is your decision." Patricia folded the document and put it in her purse. "It won't take 90 days to resolve Mr. Miller's employment status." Brandon looked around the ballroom desperately, seeking support from the 180 wedding guests who had just witnessed his spectacular downfall. He found none. "Sarah," he pleaded, turning to his wife, "say something. Tell them this is crazy." Sarah looked at her husband with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, analytical, final. "I think you've said enough for both of us." The next 72 hours unfolded exactly as I'd predicted. Monday morning, Patricia Wells called an emergency meeting with Morgan Stanley's regional director. By noon, Brandon Miller's employment was terminated for conduct detrimental to client relationships and company reputation. By Tuesday, word had spread through Austin's financial community. The Austin Business Journal ran a story. Morgan Stanley, executive fired after public confrontation with billionaire client. They didn't name Brandon specifically, but everyone in the industry knew. By Wednesday, Brandon's Texas banking license was under review, and 3 headhunters who'd been courting him had stopped returning his calls. Sarah stayed with us that first week while Brandon moved out of their downtown condo. She didn't say much, just sat in the living room where she'd grown up, processing the complete destruction of everything she thought she knew about her family and her marriage. "Why didn't you tell me?" she finally asked on Thursday evening. We were sitting on the back porch, watching the sunset over the hill country, the same porch where I'd taught her to ride a bike, where we'd talked about her first job, where she'd brought Brandon for Sunday dinners for 2 years. "Your mother and I wanted you to be proud of what you built yourself." But Brandon made me feel ashamed of where I came from. "That wasn't about where you came from. That was about his character." Sarah was quiet for a long time. Then, "I should have defended you." "You were trying to keep peace in your marriage. I understand that. But it wasn't peace. It was just submission." That word hung in the air between us. "Sarah, look at me." She turned, and I saw Margaret's eyes looking back at me. Strong, intelligent, uncompromising when it mattered. "You are the daughter of Margaret and James Anderson. Your mother built our family's foundation while raising you to be independent and strong. I built our financial foundation while teaching you that work has dignity, regardless of what form it takes." Her eyes were bright with tears. "You graduated summa cum laude from UT. You landed your job at Dell on merit. You've earned every opportunity you've received. Brandon Miller didn't elevate you. He diminished you. But I let him. Because you loved him. Because you wanted your marriage to work. Because you tried to see the best in someone who wasn't worthy of your effort. I reached over and took her hand. That doesn't make you weak. That makes you generous. But generosity has limits. The next week, Sarah filed for divorce. Brandon contested it, of course. He hired Austin's most expensive divorce attorney and tried to claim that I'd interfered with his marriage and destroyed his career through false pretenses. His lawyer lasted exactly 2 days. The moment they saw the documentation of Brandon's behavior, the recorded evidence from the wedding reception, and the testimony from Patricia Wells, they withdrew from the case. Brandon ended up representing himself in mediation, where he demanded half of Sarah's family assets. Mr. Miller, the mediator explained patiently, those assets belong to Mr. Anderson. Your wife has no claim to her father's business holdings. But they were hidden. She didn't know about them. That doesn't create a marital asset. If anything, it demonstrates that Mr. Anderson deliberately kept his wealth separate from your household. Brandon walked away from the marriage with exactly what he'd brought into it. Nothing. By Christmas, Sarah had moved back to Austin permanently. Dell offered her a position in their corporate development division, with a 40% salary increase and equity participation. She bought a house in Terrytown, close enough to visit, but far enough to maintain her independence. Brandon moved to Dallas, where he eventually found work with a smaller investment firm at 60% of his previous salary. His reputation in Austin was permanently damaged, and his Texas banking license remained under review. The ripple effects continued for months. Patricia Wells reached out personally to apologize and to propose expanding our business relationship. Morgan Stanley's wealth management division now handles $500 million in Anderson Properties assets. The Forbes article from 2018 was republished online with an updated profile. This time, I agreed to an interview. Success isn't about proving yourself to people who don't respect you, I told the reporter. Success is about building something that makes their respect irrelevant. The article went viral. 3 months later, I received an invitation to speak at the University of Texas Business School about quiet leadership in real estate development. 200 students attended. Many of them were first-generation immigrants, working-class kids who looked like I had 40 years ago. Never let anyone make you apologize for where you started, I told them, and never let anyone convince you that quiet dignity is the same as weakness. After the speech, a young woman approached me. She had an accent I recognized, Irish, like mine had been 40 years ago. Mr. Anderson, I'm working construction to pay for business school. People tell me I should be ashamed of manual labor. What's your name? Katie Murphy. Katie, let me tell you something. The people who look down on honest work are usually the people who've never built anything lasting. You keep building, keep learning, keep growing. I handed her my business card. When you graduate, call me. Anderson Properties is always looking for people who understand work. 6 months later, Katie Murphy became our newest property development manager. Because the best revenge isn't destroying people who underestimate you. The best revenge is proving that their opinions never mattered in the first place. 2 years later, Sarah remarried. His name is David Wilson, a software engineer who works for a startup downtown. When she brought him to Sunday dinner for the first time, he shook my hand firmly and said, Mr. Anderson, Sarah tells me you built something incredible here. I'd love to hear about your journey sometime. No assumptions, no condescension, just genuine curiosity about our family's story. During dinner, when David asked about my transition from construction to real estate development, Sarah jumped in. Dad started with one duplex and built it into a billion-dollar company over 36 years. He's one of Austin's most successful businessmen. Her voice carried pride, not apology. That's incredible, David said. What was your biggest challenge in those early years? We talked for 2 hours about cash flow management, property acquisition strategies, and market timing. David asked thoughtful questions and listened carefully to the answers. When he left that night, he thanked Margaret and me for dinner, complimented Sarah on her family, and asked if he could come back the following week. "I like him," I told Sarah after he'd gone. "Why?" "He sees you clearly." "He sees us clearly. He doesn't need to diminish anyone to feel successful." 6 months later, David proposed, not with a speech about marrying up or humble backgrounds or different kinds of people. Just, "Sarah Anderson, you're the most intelligent, capable, generous woman I've ever met. Will you marry me?" She said yes. Their wedding was smaller than the first one, 80 guests instead of 180. David's colleagues from the startup world, Sarah's friends from Dell, and family from both sides. I walked Sarah down the aisle again, but this time her smile was different, confident, uncompromised, free. During his toast, David said, "I'm not marrying into Sarah's family. I'm joining it, and I'm honored to be part of a legacy built on hard work, integrity, and quiet strength." No one mentioned humble backgrounds or working-class origins or immigrants making good. Just a man celebrating the woman he loved and the family that shaped her. After dinner, David pulled me aside. "Mr. Anderson, I want you to know something. I'm not intimidated by your success. I'm inspired by it. That's the difference between you and the last guy." Sarah told me about Brandon, about the wedding, about everything that happened. "What did you think?" "I think he got exactly what he deserved. And I think Sarah learned something important about standing up for people she loves." David was right. Sarah had learned. She'd learned that love without respect is just enabling. She'd learned that family loyalty matters more than keeping peace. She'd learned that she didn't need anyone's permission to be proud of where she came from. These days, Sarah works in venture capital, helping startups scale their operations. She's particularly passionate about funding companies founded by immigrants and first-generation Americans. People who built something from nothing understand value, she tells her partners. They don't take success for granted. David's startup was acquired last year for $180 million. He's now CTO of the acquiring company, leading a team of 40 developers. When reporters ask about his rapid success, he always mentions his wife's family. Sarah taught me that real strength is quiet, that real power doesn't need to announce itself, that the most successful people are often the ones you'd never suspect. As for Brandon Miller, I hear he's doing fine in Dallas, married again to a woman who appreciates his stories about working in high-end real estate in Austin. I hope he's learned something from our encounter. I hope he treats his new wife's family with respect. I hope he's grown. But honestly, I don't think about Brandon Miller very much anymore. Because the most important lesson from that wedding night wasn't about revenge or consequences or proving people wrong. It was about knowing your worth, regardless of whether anyone else recognizes it. Respect isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn and lose, and sometimes, if you're very lucky, learn.